Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Bridging Educational Achievement and Economic Equity for Black Women Through Policy. My name is Dr. Denise Smith. I'm the Deputy Director of Higher Education Policy and the Senior Fellow at the Century Foundation. I am also serving as tonight's moderator. Before I go further, I wanted to share a few logistics with the audience. So just so you know, all attendees' microphones and videos will be turned off. Please use our Q&A feature to submit your questions to the panelists. And the session will be recorded, and so please know that you'll be able to visit this event later on. And the closed caption is provided. So to access the feature, please find the closed caption button or CC button on the webinar toolbar. Also, you can learn more about the work that is happening with this dynamic group of women at the Century Foundation .org or www.tcf.org, as well as blackgirlsoncampus.org. And we'll share more about that later on in the show. So now that we've got that out the way, I do want to jump right into our program. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the Century Foundation, it is a progressive independent think tank that produces and conducts research, develops solutions, and drives policy change to make people's lives better. We are pleased to partner with the Mary Jane Legacy Project for tonight's important conversation. The Mary Jane Legacy Project, the Mary Jane Patterson Legacy Project, is a Lumina Foundation-funded initiative and the first nationwide examination of Black women's post-secondary and post-baccalaureate pathways. The Mary Jane Legacy Project will be the first national archive capturing these experiences from a wide array of Black women college graduates, detailing both the challenges and benefits of earning a college degree. The project's namesake honors Mary Jane Patterson, the first Black woman in the U.S. to earn a bachelor's degree. Currently, Black women are considered the most educated group in the U.S., yet they experience significant poverty, boast the highest student loan debt, and experience significant pay inequity despite earning a college degree. The juxtaposition of their academic success in terms of college degree attainment alongside their continued struggle for equity during and beyond college has not been comprehensively explored. This webinar will explore various issues, policy-related topics, and developments concerning Black women in higher education. Inspired by the project's research findings, a three-part policy brief series of the Mary Jane Legacy Project's findings will be housed on tcf.org. Our conversation is particularly important and timely with the upcoming election, the lack of the focus on higher education affordability and access, the overturning of affirmative action, and the rampant anti-DEI legislation across the country. All of these policies are impacting students' decisions to go to, through, and beyond college. But we still know very little about Black women given the broader discourse. Our goal today is twofold. First, we focus on Black women's collegiate experiences. Second, we place these very real experiences into policy contexts, where Black women's voices are seldom heard. Our expert panelists will engage in an interactive discussion, share their expertise, and exchange ideas and address questions from the audience. Tonight is also special as it commemorates Mary Jane Patterson's birthday. It is as a celebration of Mary Jane Patterson's life and legacy. We wanted to share two brief reflections on what her accomplishments mean to Black women in post-secondary education through these two videos.
Hello, I'm Dr. Jeffrey Ann Wilder, and I'm the founding director of the newly launched Center for Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at Oberlin College. I'd like to offer a very warm welcome to you this evening on behalf of Oberlin. In December of 2021, Oberlin announced that it would develop and launch the Center for Race, Equity, and Inclusion. Our center seeks to elevate and bring to the fore our institution's work on race, equity, and inclusion, thereby supporting Oberlin's mission to do good and building upon its important role as a leading voice in the national conversation on race. The center, which officially launched in June of this year, will bring together academic opportunities, co-curricular experiences, career programming, mentorship programs, community building, and civic engagement. Part of this work is paying homage to the legacy, current day contributions, and future impact of Black women in education. This legacy includes honoring the life of Mary Jane Patterson, who is considered to be the first African American woman to earn a bachelor's degree. Mary Jane was born in North Carolina in 1840. Her family arrived in Ohio sometime in the 1850s. At the age of 17, Mary began studying at Oberlin. For those of you who may not know, Oberlin was the first predominantly white college in the United States to admit Black men, and later, the first to admit women of all races. In 1862, Mary earned a Bachelor of Arts in Education, becoming the first Black woman to earn the degree in the United States. And, of course, she graduated with honors. As you embark on your conversation today, take a moment to reflect on your path. Who lit and guided your educational footsteps along the way? For me, it was many women, but it includes my grandmother, Mary Lou Wilson, my mother, Dr. Gloria Janine Woolard Wilder, my aunt, Dr. Linda Wilson Jones, and my cousin, Dr. Joyce Ann Ladner. They are shining examples of excellence and brilliance in action. And as we look back to our individual and collective legacies, let us continue to honor and center Black women's collegiate experiences in the name of reclamation, impact, and sustainability, now and into the future. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Corey Minor Smith. I'm an attorney, author, and advocate that also served as an elected official. I currently serve as senior counsel for the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development as an appointee with the Biden-Harris administration. It was my honor and privilege to participate in the Mary Jane Patterson Legacy Project. To understand and learn about her rich legacy is inspiring. To know that she is the first African American woman to earn a college degree in the United States is empowering. I didn't always value education. When I was in the 8th grade, my mom presented my report card to me to show me that I didn't even earn a 3.0 GPA. Even more disappointing, I didn't know what a GPA was at the time. After attending 14 schools and moving at least 21 times before I graduated from high school, I learned the value of education. I also learned the significance of educators and counselors that invested their time in helping to guide youth to learn their potential and to thrive. I appreciate people like Mary Jane Patterson that dedicated their lives and careers to helping others excel in education. Thank you for continuing her legacy. Thank you for committing your time to helping others to find their paths forward in education. Education that can direct greater opportunities that they may not see for themselves. Your work is invaluable. Thank you for your service through the Mary Jane Patterson Legacy Project. It will help to bring about change in policies, change that is needed in order to guide practices that can be easily implemented in order to help generations to come. Your work is invaluable, and the legacy of Mary Jane Patterson is strong. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey Ann and Corey, for offering these amazing perspectives, which literally set the stage for our panel discussion. Tonight, we have the honor of welcoming an amazing group of panelists. I'm very, very excited to be able to introduce them to you tonight. First up, Dr. Lori Patton Davis, professor of University of California, Los Angeles. Dr. Venus Evans Winters, she's the visiting professor at Ohio State University and at the African American Policy Forum and the founder of Planet Venus Institute. Dr. LaWanda Ward, associate professor of education and director for the Center of Study for Higher Education at Pennsylvania State University. And Dr. Kayla Elliott, Director of Workforce Policy at Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies and Managing Director of Baker Butler Black Consulting. Thank you all for joining us this evening. Dr. Evans Winters, I would love to start with you. As a leading scholar on the inclusion of Black women and girls in education policy discourses, could you start by explaining why it's so challenging to recognize our presence and contributions? Specifically, why are the needs of Black women and girls often treated as inconsequential despite our educational successes?
Yes, thank you, Denise, for that introduction, and thank you for this question. Now, typically when people ask us, why is it that Black women and girls' presence and contributions are overlooked? Usually the response is that it's complex. Well, I'm here to tell you it's not complex. It's very simple. We live in a nation that historically has privileged wealth, whiteness, and masculinity. So Black women overall, as a population group, we're more likely to be underpaid and underemployed. And that's because we are situated in hyper-racial segregation. We experience hyper-racial segregation in our school communities, as well as gender biases across the workplace. Historically, also, we don't fit into narrowly defined and confined gender norms. And these gender norms are based off white femininity as the standard. So the further we are from that spectrum of white femininity, which we can never hardly achieve, at least not in this country, the further we are away from being accepted. Now, what this means for us from a discourse perspective is that we are basically whited out in gender discourse and policies, and we're blacked out in racial discourse and policies considerations. So our presence is overlooked, we are ignored, or we are isolated in both educational and workplace communities, and also our contributions. And when I say contributions, specifically our social contributions, our cultural contributions, our intellectual contributions, and our political and economic contributions are both misappropriated and invalidated. And so our needs are determined to be inconsequential despite our educational successes and economic achievements. And Patricia Smith, a legal scholar in 1991, she would frame all of this as these erasures as a spirit kill. Kimberly Crenshaw, another legal scholar, would refer to it as erasures. Africanist scholar Raylan Rabaka, he refers to it in higher education, in our knowledge acquisitions, as epistemic apartheid. But I'm here to tell us today that I prefer to refer to it as racialized, gender-based intellectual terrorism. And I am drawing this from the experiences just over the last year or two, as we've witnessed with Doctors Candia Bailey, Claudine Gay, and the Honorable Ketanji Brown. In other words, we are collateral damage in the current social and political context.
Dr. Evans Winters, you broke that down so well and provided a lot of background and context for what we are experiencing. And I think viscerally what some Black women are feeling when it comes to how they're experiencing themselves in the workplace. I think now I want to pivot to Dr. Patton Davis, because I want to make sure that we get to you, because as one of the PIs for the Mary Jane Legacy Project, you had the opportunity to actually listen to Black women discuss factors contributing to their college choice process. Can you highlight some of the things that they shared about the process and the need for policymakers to consider how Black women experience college choice process?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Denise. So in our analysis thus far, we're finding that Black women attend college, and it's often related to like a personal connection, like a family member or a friend attending college. And they also mentioned, just having access to pre-collegiate programs like TRIO programs, since many of our participants were first-generation college students. And they sought a good fit with the campus. And so often this fit had to do with, visiting campus and seeing other Black women on campus or seeing other Black students and having an opportunity to connect with them. And I think the cultural fit really resonated for women who attended HBCUs or who participated in programs that exposed them to other Black students. The other aspect that guided choice dealt with institutional reputation. So that was usually for women who tended to be high achievers. So it was more important to go to a prestigious institution. But despite all of these factors, much of their decision-making around college was ultimately determined by affordability. So you could go and visit an institution and have a really great experience, but if you couldn't afford it or if you didn't get enough, financial aid, then that usually wasn't an option. So most of the participants required some form of financial aid and scholarships for them to even see college as a possibility. And so what we hope policymakers see is the importance of pre-collegiate programs, which bring greater exposure to college as an option and offer support for financial aid. And also opportunities that better explain the funding process or the financial aid process, and that brings families in because of students being first generation. And a lot of them simply didn't know at the time what this process looked like. And so I even in interviews, some of the ones that I conducted, you had women saying, I was a junior before I learned that I had, this opportunity available to me, or, I had no idea. And I think another piece, as we continue to go through, a lot of these women are kind of going through this process alone. It's not that they don't have people to ask questions, but there isn't a good partner along the way, right? Who's sort of guiding them in the way that they might need to get to college and make a choice that's good for them.
Wow, so I'm hearing several through lines there, talking about familial connection. I'm hearing the cost is also a factor that women are taking into consideration, the reputation of an institution. And I think there's a lot of things that go into play there when it comes to what policymakers should be thinking about. I know for me, as a person that went to HBCUs, my seeing my older siblings move into their dormitories, visiting my cousins on their campuses, that for me was the reason why I wanted to attend a HBCU. And so, Kayla, I'm gonna turn to you, Dr. Elliott, because your work has focused on HBCUs, and many of the participants in the study shared their love for HBCUs and the feeling of legacy and community being the reason for their choice. Can you talk a little bit about the moment HBCUs are having with the increase in applications and legislation, and legislatively what we should be considering to support these students and the institutions that serve them?
Yeah, thank you. And listen, third generation HBCU alum, so I hear you, right? Like they are special places, and I'm glad to see that more students, more families, more communities are recognizing what's special about them for sure. I think like that rise is absolutely due that we're seeing really over the last 5 years, the last 4 in particular, um, and the attention after the murder of George Floyd, the just consistent like call of Black Lives Matter and other groups, like people are beginning to not just think about where they spend their time, but also where they spend their resources. And both of those things are a matter of college choice, as Dr. Patton said, right? So Black students are seeking safety, Black students are seeking community, and they're seeking an academic life where they're no longer at the margins, but they're at the center, right? Whether that is who they dorm room with, right? What they eat in the cafeteria, what they learn in their classrooms, what their professors look like. They're looking for experiences where they have more mirrors than windows. And I think that is something that is unique and healthy and all too rare for sure. And with that, like increase in applications, they're actually converting that to enrollment, which is not true across higher education at large, right? Like enrollment has slowed for most institutions, but this particular subsector, which is only 100 institutions, about a dozen of them are community colleges, right? Like we say HBCUs, but we don't realize that they are such a small group in the broader landscape of higher education institutions. So the fact that as a whole they are seeing that increase is really amazing, and that increase is not just in applications but enrollments is something that the rest of higher ed is not seeing is wonderful, because we know who's attending. We know that it's us. We know that it is Black women in particular who have seen real growth in enrollment, not just over the last 4 years, but long term for sure. Legislatively, I think I made the transition, as you all know, from working exclusively on higher ed policy to more embracing workforce policy and workforce development in my role at the Joint Center. And I am so impressed by the investments that are being made into HBCUs and the opportunities that are being provided federally, not just through the Department of Education, but also through the Department of Labor, through the Department of Energy, through NSF and STEM education, through commerce, health and human services. The term whole of government investments has been used to talk about that. And I always want to point out that's a good thing, right? Title III funds are limited, and we're not the only institutions that get them. So the fact that we are getting federal investments that not only address our identities as HBCUs, but also address our research capacity, the COVID relief funding that allowed them to address students' basic needs, allowed them to address infrastructure at the institutions. All of those things are incredibly important. And the more we are able to draw from different spouts and have a piece of multiple pies, the more resources that is, and the better off the institutions and their infrastructure are for sure. So it's been really good to see research and development dollars. It's been really good to see investments into infrastructure, both in terms of buildings, right? But also in terms of technology infrastructure, both for students, but also for research as well. So it's been nice to see that. It's also been nice to see some loans eliminated, right? So the capital finance debt relief that 45 different public and private HBCUs received, we all know, discharging debt then allows your finances to be freed up for more for those same needs that we've already been listed, right? And so it's been nice to see those investments legislatively, but judicially, there are definitely some challenges, which I'll get into later. I think in terms of Black women specifically, the Supreme Court knocking down the Biden administration's expanded Title IX rules and protections for students who are women and or LGBTQ is an issue, right? Because while HBCUs, for many of us, are safe havens based on our racial identity, they do have work to do to make us have real safety in terms of our sex and sexuality for sure. And so I think long term, as I'm thinking about legislative priorities, policy priorities in general, making sure that HBCUs are well positioned to receive those record federal investments in jobs and industry across the Investing in America agenda. And that's opportunities again for research, service, infrastructure, jobs, and apprenticeships for students and alumni, but also really thinking really clearly about what you mentioned in your opening, and that's HBCUs, which are really overwhelmingly represented in states that have strict anti-DEI laws, and what that means for their funding allocations, what that means for their relationships with the governor's office, who are essentially their bosses for the public institutions, but how they are expected to twist and turn and navigate under these new rules. And that means strengthening capacity in terms of lobbyists, elected and appointed state officials, state level HBCU caucuses, like some states have started to establish, and students and alum who are active voters.
Thank you for laying all that out, Kayla, Dr. Elliott, excuse me, because it is very much really putting together in my mind a blueprint for what a policy agenda should look like that centers Black women, but also ensuring that everyone else also will immediately benefit. And the role that HBCUs play is incredibly crucial, as we know that Black women over-index in enrollment at HBCUs, right? But you said something earlier about safety, which is going to put me to Dr. Ward for her question, because Dr. Ward, your work has consistently highlighted the challenges that Black women students in college face, especially including those related to both students and faculty. But could you discuss how the recent overturning of affirmative action has impacted Black women students, particularly in ways that might not be immediately apparent to policymakers or the general public? Specifically, how has this issue affected Black women when considering the intersection of race, gender, and class?
Thank you, Denise, for the question. So as people are familiar, the United States Supreme Court last June basically dismantled the ability for institutions to use race as a consideration factor for admissions. Now, of course, they quote unquote left the door open so that students can talk about race within their application materials. What remains to still be seen is how admissions officers and others tasked with assisting with the admissions process will view those essays. Just over the last couple of weeks, institutions are starting to provide reports in terms of their admissions. And it's something that I think is important for us to consider. One is that quite a few of the reports are about selective institutions, which are the ones that were involved in the United States Supreme Court decisions. So it's always important for us to pay attention to what institutional types are being focused on in reports. So the ones that I've seen so far are about selective institutions, specifically giving reports about the class of 2028, which would be students graduating within 4 years. And, that's part of the dominant discourse, but we know in reality, it takes many students, including Black women, more time for degree completion. But at any rate, there's a focus on the class of 2028. With the Harvard data, 14% of students identify as Black, and the report is that there's 4% less Black students admitted to Harvard this year. There's also a report about MIT, which is the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. The report is that Black and Latinos, those numbers, there's a 15% drop from last year. So while these reports are helpful, they do not provide us with an intersectional perspective on the data. They are only focused on race and not the gendered race realities of Black women. So in terms of thinking about the 4 themes from the report, because it specifically focuses on Black women and what they value in higher education, what I would say policymakers and the general public may not be considering right now is really some of the things that have been alluded to. Black women prioritize feeling a personal connection. And those things are very important to them. And so when we think about this initial impact of the race-conscious admissions decision and it going forward, there's going to be a continued reduction, at least at historically and predominantly white institutions. There's going to be less students of color, and specifically less Black women. And so when Black women go into these campus spaces and they're looking to see themselves, it's highly likely, even more so, that they won't see themselves represented. Another theme with the report is that Black women rely heavily on institutional guidance, recruitment, and support. And so in terms of thinking about Black women's experiences, the secondary education experience matters, right? So we think about who are these guidance counselors? These people need to be culturally equipped so that they can support Black women in their higher education institutional selection. And then, of course, also thinking about the admissions officers. Who are these people? Where are they going and being intentional about reaching out to Black women? And what are they sharing with them in terms of resources? There was one participant in the study who talked about an institution had sent her information, I believe sent her an application. And so that type of intentionality institutions will continue to need to do if they are committed to bringing, retaining, and helping Black women thrive within their institutions. I think something else that's likely not very obvious, because again, a lot of policymakers, as well as the public, don't always think about Black women when they think about issues that need to be addressed so that campus climates can be conducive for student growth and advancement. Black women, listening to them, hearing their experiences about the gendered racism and other types of discriminatory discriminatory actions that they encounter, they need to be at the forefront so that institutions can, the ones that say they have the commitment to DEI of saying Black women are an important group within our campus communities. And so what do we need to do to signal to them that these campus environments will be supportive to them? Thank you.
Thank you for that, Dr. I'm gonna stick with you too, because I know your scholarship has also looked into the erasure of Black women in higher education. And examining research on community colleges, Black women have not been centered as often, especially as it pertains to them choosing community colleges. Yet many participants shared that this was their choice due to flexibility and managing competing responsibilities, having families. So can you share a little bit about what you're seeing in the field as it pertains to Black women and community colleges? Also, because programs like the American College Promise and ACP are now defunct, what are other policies or strategies community colleges can use to support their students, particularly Black women?
So what I'm seeing, and I'm happy to see and encouraged by, is that there are more scholars, and no surprise, many of them Black women, who are conducting qualitative studies in which Black women's experiences within the community college context is being centered. So for example, there's a study by Adrienne Grayson, where actually as a result of that study, she created a community college academic Black women's self-actualization model. And that model is intended to specifically explore the experiences of Black women. No different than four-year institutions, community colleges need to take holistic approaches to supporting Black women. In terms of thinking about policy and especially institutional leaders, governing boards need to examine the discrimination and the harassment that Black women experience from their peers, staff, and faculty. They also need to be intentional. The COVID-19 pandemic, the racial injustice that was heightened even during that time period, really exacerbated students needing support. And in one study of Black women at community colleges, they talked about community colleges needing to provide mental health services for them. And of course, we want those people to be culturally competent professionals to be able to support the unique and nuanced needs of Black women. Within the community college context, scholars are bringing to our attention that Black women disproportionately are experiencing housing insecurities as well as food insecurity. And so community colleges ideally would partner with community-based organizations so that when Black women and they enroll during registration, they can be directed to resources that can support them, again, in this holistic way. And then Black women need spaces to be communal and to dialogue with each other. And so my hope is that as scholars continue to do these explorations, they also continue to give us recommendations that institutional leaders can use in terms of how they can be thoughtful in supporting the needs of Black women.
Thank you for that, Dr. Ward. Dr. Elliott, I'm gonna come back to you because you've examined economic policy with a particular emphasis on student loan debt that you alluded to earlier. But given recent challenges like the Department of Education's FAFSA rollout debacle, so to speak, can you kind of talk about how the Biden-Harris administration struggled with the student debt relief issues, and what bold policy recommendations would you propose for the future of college financing? And what areas remain unexplored, but warranted investigation based off of your research findings and what key aspects are policymakers currently overlooking in light of your research?
Yeah, definitely. And I think great lead in from Dr. Ward, right? Really talking about the very real financial and economic insecurities that Black women are facing at a disproportionate rate, right? Like 40% of Black women in college are also already parents, right? So they have a broader financial responsibility of supporting a family while they're students, but also after. So Black women, in terms of student debt, hold more student debt than any other demographic. 12 years after starting college, Black women owe 13% more than they borrowed compared to white men, who by then have paid off almost half of their debt. Almost half of Black women who began college in 2003 defaulted on their loans within 12 years. And we know that default can ruin a person's credit, limit their ability to even buy or rent a car, a home, or even get a job, right? And so, like, part of the issue is, yes, a lack of generational wealth, structural racism, a lack of borrowing power, right? Insufficient supports, and a number of other challenges. But a real part of the issue is also lower wages, right? Longer term, even if you are in a high yield field or a high income field, you are then making less than your peers. So lower wages on the back end of college education is saddling Black women with debt long after their degree completion. So I think that in terms of bold policies, right? The longer I am in DC, I always say, the longer I am in DC, the more clear I am that anything is possible, but few things are probable, right? And so you mentioned that I founder of Baker Butler Black Consulting, and it's named for Ella Baker, Octavia Butler, and Black women everywhere who dream of a better future. And to me, that means like bold does not always mean extreme. Like bold doesn't even mean uncommon. Bold at this point is common sense, right? Like bold policy stances like canceling all student debt, bold policy stances, like you said, to make 2-year college free, not just tuition free, but free. Your transportation, your books, your childcare, the real wraparound supports that you need to be able to go to school without having to work inordinate hours to achieve it, right? And making sure that credential means something, and expanding the Pell Grant and tying it to inflation. The Pell Grant had a lot more purchasing power some years ago. So at its peak, it was about like 3/4 of the cost of college, and now it's like a third, right? And so I think that is, there's a lot of talk about inflation, but that I think is really being overlooked in terms of what policymakers are not really understanding. And in my time at Ed Trust, we had my late colleague and Dr. Andrew Nichols and my colleague Dr. Tiffany Jones had an opportunity to produce a report around race-conscious policy. And the entire premise was that we have, as a country, had laws that are explicit about race since our beginning, since before our beginning, right? And those laws did damage. We still need laws that are explicit about race to undo that damage, right? And start the healing and start what a real future can look like. And unfortunately, we're headed back in the wrong direction. I think being clear, being explicit, being real about race in the law shouldn't be bold. It shouldn't be bold. It should be a recognition of where we have been as a country and where we need to go. But I think, like, back to like inflation, I think there's a lot of conversation around it. This isn't a new policy stance, tying actual financial aid, tying the cost of college, tying Pell Grants to inflation. I do think that there is an ignorance around the purchasing power of Pell, the ability to pay, and the idea that folks can borrow money from their parents or grandparents, or that they can work their way through college. That is near impossible, even for a 2-year degree without any other familial responsibilities. And so I think there is a real ignorance about the cost of college. There's an ignorance about the need for debt. there's an ignorance about the way that debt is structured, right? The amount of interest that is being charged, and the real common sense things we can do to alleviate the financial burden that college is putting on students instead of on states to make real investments, on employers to pay people fairly and equitably, and on the federal government to tie real supports to inflation as well.
Wow. Okay, Kayla. So you have a whole policy agenda for how we address
That's
all
the
of
job.
these.
That's the job.
I appreciate that because I do want to also just, I know we're still dealing with a lot when it comes to how we're helping people navigate college. So I do want to go back to Dr. Evans Winters because I appreciate your contributions as a psychotherapist and healer, and given the ongoing effects of COVID-19, there is a clear demand for research and practical initiatives in both fields. Upon analysis of the study data, various barriers were encountered by Black women in higher education were underscored. Several of these have been discussed here, but a significant focus was on the influence of mental health and their scholastic and social achievements. What interventions, strategies, or resources would you propose to aid Black women in effectively navigating the challenges, such as the things that Kayla just talked about, the financial, the familial, the cultural, being like the only Black woman at a PWI on campus, right, as an example, and some of those other social barriers?
Yes, and this is where I think intersectionality or multiple consciousness actually serves us. So this is where these entanglements come in at, Denise. So when we listen to Drs. Elliott, Patton Davis, and Ward, we start to see the nuances of what it means to be a Black woman, girl, or femme in these spaces, right? So yes, I am a policy professor, but I'm also a licensed school social worker. I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I'm also a clinical complex trauma professional levels 1 and 2. What that means is that I see some of the harshest cases, and usually they fall at the intersection of race, gender, and class, right? And so when we ask about these interventions and strategies, I'm so happy we can have this conversation, honestly, in this space, so we can take off our cloaks. We can take off our masks. We can take off our scarves, and honey, we can take off our bonnets, okay? And so what we have to do, we have to think about it from a policy perspective, and we have to think about it from a cultural perspective. These institutions can't and won't and aren't interested in saving us. So let's just be clear. We've been waiting almost 400 years, y'all. I don't think it's gonna come. And so let me tell you a quick story, and I think I've narrowed it down to approximately 30 seconds. I started off my day at 9 a.m. teaching undergraduate students. And then I sat in with the National Black Women's Justice Institute, and they launched a new database. You all should check it out. So I sat in on that launch. And then I'm training for a marathon. If you're following me over social media, you already know that because I have to disclose that information so all of you can cheer for me. Okay, 26.2 miles. But I still had to get my run in today so that I can be with you all here today, Denise. And then I still had to teach right before this class. So as I'm running, I'm approximately 1 mile in. And I noticed that there's a woman who's down in the middle of the street. And if you know anything about college campuses, around 3 or 4 o'clock, it's very crowded, right? 2 or 3 o'clock is very crowded. So already I'm up, I'm hot, my body's warm. It's about approximately 90 degrees outside. And when I saw the woman down, another pedestrian actually somebody driving by saw the woman down, I immediately shot across the street. Don't know where I got the energy from. This is a Black woman, a Black presenting woman who's down. And I noticed that the woman who was assisting a white woman, younger, she could not lift her. Don't know where I got the energy, ran over there, I picked her up. Okay, now what's interesting, Denise, I'm not the biggest woman in the world. I'm a little bigger than I was pre-COVID, but I'm not the biggest or the tallest woman in the world. I was born short too, okay? But I had to help lift this woman up. But as I'm crossing the street, do you know I dared not once but twice to stop traffic? Two-way traffic. Yes, and I did it because the drivers couldn't see her. She couldn't see us, but I had to use my body to stop them. Another sister, she was delivering mail. And she said, you need water. I had to drop back over there, run and grab the water and give it to the sister who was down on the ground, try to give her some sugar, all kinds of stuff is going on in this moment. But then I wanted to continue. I got her calmed down. Mind you, I can't call the police. I cannot call the police for many reasons, but I had to triage her. In the meantime, the white woman left, the white man left and said, thank you for being with her. And I thought, interesting, I got stuck with her, but I did my job. So, as you know, Black women are socialized and we are conditioned to take care of other Black women and girls, to take care of the men folk, and to take care of our elders. Also, like I said, as a social worker, I am taught to triage and step in during moments of crises. I finished, closed up the situation. I continued with another 6 miles to go. Throughout the run, I could not get my heart rate back down. In fact, I thought I was going to have a heart attack. Dr. Lori Patton was going to have to get me because she knows my locations. Okay. But you see, this is how we step in. And this is what Black women and young women need to know in these academic spaces. Not only are we doing our jobs while also trying to take care of ourselves, we never know when we will be hit by another crisis. Now, interestingly enough, as I was running mile 3, 4, 5, I could still smell the woman on me. So it just kept triggering me. But as you know, when we're doing the work, a student is going to tell their story. Another Black woman professor is going to tell her story. Another person might be killed in the media at the hands of police officers or whomever. And so our heart rates, our cortisone is always kicking in, right? And so this is exactly why we need to have these mental health and social well-being conversations in academic and workspaces, academic learning and workspaces. And this is why Planet Venus was created during the pandemic. Black women have report higher rates of fatigue, higher rates of loneliness, higher rates of anxiety, and all of that is leading to cardiovascular disease and diabetes. Okay, so I remember when suicide was completed by Dr. Claudine Bailey, and I said, you know what? Everybody said, oh my God, we need prayers. Yes, you all. We need prayers, but we also need policies. We need to put policies and practices in place. So I'm gonna leave our audience here. And I was thinking about the Mary Jane Legacy Project, and I kept thinking, what was she going through? If we crying today, could you imagine what she went through? Existing and living and breathing in a Black woman's body, trying to demonstrate, illustrate, and prove her intellectuality and knowledge for the people. But guess what we need? I'm gonna give y'all an acronym today, PACE. Because I kept trying to pace myself. I had a long way to go. Had to pace myself so that we can get back here. We need practices and policies that protect us. We need policies and practices that protect Black women unapologetically, unabashedly. We need affirming practices. I'm looking at all these beautiful scholars right here, practitioners, philanthropists, business owners, mothers, daughters, sisters, and I'm seeing our hair. We're showing up with our hair. The lip game is on point, by the way, y'all. We're looking at all these beautiful clothes, you know, that we're wearing. We're speaking a second and third language. I'm like, this is not even many of our primary languages, right? But we need affirming practices, how we speak, how we walk, how we talk, how we dress. Give us time to breathe, which brings me to the P, policies that protect. Affirming practices is the A. The other part of PACE is compassionate care communities. Don't hire one of us. Hire 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 of us in cohorts. Okay. Also, don't recruit one student. Don't just bring in Black faculty to always be Black women faculty to only be teaching predominantly white students. Also recruit students at the undergraduate and graduate level too who are from racially minoritized groups. So bring in 10, 15, 25 thousands of Black women and Black girls and Black boys and other minoritized groups. So we need compassionate care communities. And finally, what nobody wants to talk about when we're talking about racial and gender justice, but I heard it here out of Dr. Elliott Wars and Patton Davis' mouth, we need economic justice. We need to call for economic policies. Yes, pay Black women, pay Black women. Invest in Black women. And so I'll just leave you all with that. PACE, policies and practices that protect us, affirming practices, compassionate care communities, and we call for economic justice.
Well, I don't know where to go from there, but PACE is all I can remember right now. PACE is what we need. And I love the acronym. So thank you so much. I do want to go to the policy piece that you talked about, Dr. Evans Winters about, and I want to go to Dr. Elliott with this as a follow-up. You've written about congressional priorities across race, and particularly in areas of wage, employment, economic security, all the things that PACE represents, right? And so participants overwhelmingly agreed they experienced with pay inequity from this study, and expressed concerns about their economic security despite having a college degree. And so what might one strategy for translating their reality into a policy context to encourage action on behalf of Black women college graduates look like? And the Black women more broadly, as the barriers that they face are getting to and through college remain present and post graduation?
Pace, right? Like, yeah, we need all those things for that exact question for sure. But on the economic security and economic justice front, I think that is the world we live in at the Joint Center for sure. Last year, they surveyed over 1,200 Black, Hispanic, white, multiracial, and Asian Americans about potential congressional priorities alongside the NORC at the University of Chicago. And so the survey asked about a number of congressional priorities, including several issues related to workers and wages, such as expanding access to paid family and medical leave and affordable childcare, protecting workers' rights to join or form a union, and allowing students to use Pell Grants to make short-term training programs more affordable. Of the workers and learners priority surveys, Black respondents' highest ranked priorities were ensuring that employers pay wages that keep up with the cost of basic necessities, increasing the federal minimum wage, and expanding access to quality job training. And of note, Black respondents had the highest ranking on every single issue about workers and wages, higher than every other demographic on every single issue, right? And that means we are not only deeply impacted by economic injustice and not only deeply concerned, but we're also deeply knowledgeable, right? Because the people closest to the problem are the people closest to the solution. And so I think I appreciate working at an organization that really surveys, but not only that, coalesces and works with like activists and folks on the ground for sure to inform our policy priorities. And more organizations need to do that and include workers' voices, include Black women's voices in their work as they're considering their policy priorities, right? So like you said, pay Black women, right? Like we know Black women in particular are impacted by wage disparities. Black Women's Equal Pay Day, which is the day that we catch up to a white man's wages from last year, was July 9th of this year, right? 6 months and 9 days later, we are just getting to their wages from the year before, right? And looping back to my last question, the National Partnership for Women and Families found that eliminating the pay gap could give Black women enough money to pay off the average student loan debt in less than 2 years. So not defaulting 12 years later, not you still owe 44%, not any of the realities that Black women are facing now. Literally paying Black women what we are owed, paying us for the work that we are doing, paying us for how we show up in these same jobs would allow us exactly what we need to dig ourselves out of that financial security, to dig ourselves out of debt, especially as the real solutions for debt cancellation continue to be met with judicial pushback, right? And so like there is absolutely a responsibility on employers. We can talk policy, we can talk practice, and the policies and practice that we have to legislate the most are employers, right? Because that is who is not only like should be held responsible, but that's who's not being held responsible. That's who's finding loopholes in the Equal Pay Act of 1963. That's who has the lawyers and the lobbyists and the money to play in worker spaces, right? To play in Black women's spaces. That's who finds the loopholes in the law to get around their real duty. And not only that, the law itself has a lot of weak consequences. And so I think we need to like strengthen the Equal Pay Act and even look to other legislation like the Paycheck Fairness Act, which would, one, enable us to have salary transparency without retribution and retaliation. It would allow Black women or women broadly, workers broadly, to come together and challenge an employee and employers like company pay pay policies, internal policies in court, and allow that lawsuit to proceed as a class action. And it would prevent employers from asking about workers' salary history. And salary history can have an especially negative impact on Black women who are already overrepresented in low-paying jobs and even in higher-earning jobs, still being paid less than our peers, right? So there are a number of different legislative tools that we can look to, but all of them have to hold employers accountable for their behavior. One thing I've really appreciated about transitioning to this role and working more workforce development and labor is an appreciation for the labor movement. This past Labor Day, really looking at Black trade unionists, looking at historically A. Philip Randolph and others who had real, the power that is there. We talk, many, the Black history buffs love to talk about how when Martin Luther King was killed, he was organizing in Memphis around what? Wages, right? We understand that when that racism is acceptable in this country, right? Racism is acceptable in this country. It's expected. But when we understand that Black women's needs, and as Denise said earlier, positioning Black women at the center actually helps everyone, right? When you address those of us who are feeling it in multiple intersectional ways, we ameliorate quite a few different harms for sure.
Wow, Caleb, thank you for sharing how you're diving into the economic policy and really connecting it back to what Black women need when it comes to pay equity. I know we've talked a lot about the need for policy, and I know Dr. Patton Davis, I do want to turn to you for our final question for the night. The congressional representatives, Robin Kelly of Illinois, Bonnie Watson Coleman of New Jersey, and Yvette Clarke of New York, and Congressman Brian Fitzgerald are co-chairs of the Caucus for Black Women and Girls, and introduced bipartisan legislation to Protect Black Women and Girls Act back in 2018, and they reintroduced it again this year. And they aim to address the targeted discrimination, harassment, and violence against Black women and girls across various sectors of American society, including education, healthcare, housing, and economic development. The legislation calls for a thorough investigation into how the American dream can be realized for Black women and girls. How might the critical research stemming from the Mary Jane Legacy Project encourage the passage of this legislation, or at least prompt policymakers and legislators to prioritize Black women and girls?
Okay. I mean, I really don't know what to say. I feel like everything has already been said. But I definitely think research can be instrumental for informing the policymaking process. So, like many of the women in our research talked about experiencing loneliness and isolation on campus, or working above and beyond as student leaders to, garner deserved recognition. And they talked about culture centers and diversity-related offices and support programs that were critical for their ability to get through college. However, as was mentioned before, we're in this space, this DEI moment, where the resources that are really supportive for Black women navigating college, or at least at PWIs, are being taken away. And so I think it's really problematic and challenging to tout this American dream in environments that are actually dream killers, right? And I also think this scenario, though it looks that way at some PWIs and in particular states, the scenario looks different at HBCUs, and that's been shared as well in this conversation, where Black women talked about having more positive experiences. And one of the things that we find really interesting is that when asked, if there was one thing that they could change about their college experiences, most said they didn't regret their experiences, right? They didn't regret their decisions, but if presented with an opportunity again, they might choose an HBCU, right? And so what that indicates to me is that HBCUs can really be a throughway, right, toward Black women realizing the American dream. But that's not possible if HBCUs are underfunded and under-resourced and don't have the capacity to serve the students who desire to attend. And so I think, it's those kinds of findings that have implications for policy. And I think legislation would be one step, especially this one, would be one step in a right direction, at least for recognizing the presence and humanity of Black women, given our historical disenfranchisement. But I also think interdisciplinary research, like what we're doing with the Mary Jane Legacy Project, what some the panelists have mentioned today, the studies, all of these things can be key to informing the policymaking process. The job really is about how we translate it, right? I'm not a policymaker, but I know I'm going to imagine they don't have time to read a 30-page article, right? But they have time to read a brief or, read some information from a study, which is why we really, are appreciative of the partnership with the Century Foundation and the policy brief series, because it's not just conducting the research, which we sorely needed. There's tons of gaps in how we understand Black women's pathways and trajectories in college. But we can't just stop at the research. There has to be a way to translate it so that people fully understand that and I want to repeat what we keep saying, it's not that these policies, even though they center Black women, they don't just benefit Black women, they benefit everybody. And so that's a message that I really hope gets hammered and consistently repeated in these policy conversations.
Well, thank you so much to all of you. I think this is a phenomenal way to move into our Q&A session. And I definitely think that we have what it takes to really be think tankish about this work and combine our efforts together to be able to create a policy agenda that I think will get the attention of legislators for sure. Just because this work has been so important and so dynamic, and it's gotten so much attention, even with the release of the first report yesterday. A lot of people have been talking about the importance of censoring Black women. So I'm going to now transition us to our Q&A session. I know we have a couple of questions in the chat already, but if folks have any additional questions, please put them in the chat now. I know one of the questions is, did the research find that some Black college women had more success at a particular type of institution? I know we talked a little bit earlier about people's experiences at HBCUs and PWIs, but Dr. Patton Davis, I don't know if you want to speak to some of the findings from the research.
So for me, yes, a lot of participants did have very successful experiences at HBCUs, but we did have some participants who maybe began at an HBCU and for whatever reason, whether it's family or finances, transitioned to a institution that was closer, or predominantly white institution. Like, there's a lot of diverse representation within the study. I think the important piece is that the way they got through often has something to do with a mentor or finding a solid peer group. It's usually a group of, Black women who supported them in getting through. So to me, and I think, I can't remember, it might have been Dr. Ward who talked about the familial connection, but it was having a group of people around you who were pushing you. So one of the participants I spoke with, she got pregnant in college, right? And she had a whole community, right, who said, okay, after you have your baby, we got this, you need to finish. And so that's the kind of support that these women talked about that helped them to get through. And people who took the time to say, once you get your bachelor's degree, that doesn't have to be it, right? Like, have you considered graduate school? So many of them had never thought about graduate school. One of the questions was, so, once you got your bachelor's degree, like, what was next? Like, what were you planning? And so many said, well, I didn't really have a plan until I spoke with, this person, or until such and such told me that graduate school was even an option. And so it's interesting to be surrounded and to be getting this sort of guidance and feedback, but it's when in graduate school, right? And you're getting a master's and a PhD, you're also accumulating debt along the way. So like, these things are intellectually fulfilling and certainly move Black women into the field of interest, but it doesn't alleviate student loan debt. It doesn't alleviate the costs associated with not receiving equitable pay and still paying off loans that are consistently capitalizing. So that was just, a very interesting dynamic.
Thank you for that response. The second question is, they said grateful to witness this conversation. I was wondering if you all had advice for anyone, especially as a Black woman herself, who is interested in doing research regarding Black women's experiences in higher education. Anybody want to take that question?
We could all offer advice.
Right.
That could be everybody.
That's true. I will say my dissertation was also focused on the lived experiences of Black women. And it really is important to be able to identify the opportunity. If you see a particular topic that needs to be explored, I tell everyone, talk to Black women, listen to Black women. There is a cultural connection that we have between each other to hear each other's stories, and to be able to listen and relay. Which is something that's very beautiful. And I think we should lean into that more. And it's important to be able to see the value of lived experience as empirical data. And so if you have the opportunity through your research program or through your doctoral program or master's program, definitely, go through the process, get IRB approval, and come up with, the questions that you would want to ask yourself. What are the questions that you would want to know and explore? To be able to do your interviews or your focus groups, or however you want to approach your work.
Yeah, and I would add, I'm pretty much familiar with most of the women's scholars' work here. Dr. Patton Davis has a great piece. He has many great pieces on higher education. And so one thing that I would like to emphasize to Denise, to our audience, to our listeners, is even the concept of pace, it comes from the idea of intersectionality. And when we think about Mary Jane Patterson, we also have to think about, what was she navigating at that particular time? But most people are now only familiar with some of the contemporary conversations around intersectionality. But the point I was trying to say as it relates to this person's question, and I think I know who the person is, the person's question is, my story was meant to help us as Black women understand that we're also running into the fire. We know we're integrating into a burning house. We and Martin Luther King, but we know I ran inside of the intersection. Many concepts of intersectionality, we think about, racism, sexism, classism, other overlapping identities coming across traffic, right? If we use that traditional image. But remember, because of my social conditioning and because of my training, I decided to run in front of traffic and also, try to stop the flow of traffic in order to protect this Black woman who was down. So what does that look like? I have a theory that many of us here, Kayla, you kind of hinted at it, sorry, Dr. Ward, I'm obviously familiar with your research too. We are re-traumatizing ourselves sometimes when we are choosing our research topics. So we have to start forewarning our young people when we say, yeah, go ahead into higher ed, go into, go and seek your PhD, further your studies, come on over here and come work with us. Right? And so I think that a part of our social, emotional, and mental health and well-being is being honest that this work is hard, but two, also understanding that many of us are re-traumatizing ourselves. Our data, the research itself can trigger us. That's why we have to protect and provide care.
You had to call us out. You had to call us out. However, I will say this perfect example. So I started my doc program in 2015. I first met Dr. Venus as a part of a broader support group of Black scholars. And I want to say about 2017, which was right around when Dr. Patton Davis was the first Black woman leader of ASH. And I remembered very vividly the feeling of being able to see her there and see her not only just there, but really embody her truth there in a number of ways, right? Dr. Ward and I last saw each other at a large foundation gathering. This is not just us sitting up talking as researchers. We see each other as people. right? And it means something that we occupy these spaces for sure. Seek those spaces out. Seek those spaces out where you can get that community care practice, right? Where you can do that, whether that's in your cohort with your faculty, or I just mentioned people who I was in Florida, they were in Ohio, but I met her in Tennessee or DC. Like, it does not have to be your immediate folks. Reach out to those of us on this call. Reach out to, if you admire a Black woman's work and want to learn from it or use it, like, that is wonderful. Cite Black women in all the ways and all the times. But be careful, like, protect yourself and your energy as you choose your program, as you choose your research, as Dr. Evans Winters just said. Like, be clear on who you are and what you want to achieve.
I echo what everyone has already said. I also, and this is for myself too, I'm always trying to think about what are the ways that I can be specific when I want to investigate something that is impacting Black women and their experiences, because we're not a monolith and we don't experience, especially when you think about institutional type, there's so many different institutional types to consider. So when you say experiences of women who are graduate students, what sort of institution, and really where are they on their journey? Because again, I think the more specific we can be with our inquiries, it really helps us to nuance what we're sharing about the various experiences of Black women. And then when we think about Black women as faculty, like what are they doing in the faculty ranks? Like, we need to be very specific as much as we can, again, about talking about those experiences. Now, one of the things is, in a lot of ways, many of the experiences will be the same, but there can be some nuances, and we need to be intentional to illuminate those as well.
Awesome. I want to be mindful of time. I know there's a couple more questions in the chat. I know Dr. Patton Davis, they wanted to bounce off of your their response to your first question, or the first response. The question is, does any of that research hone in on the experiences of Black women at HBCUs that are also women's colleges? If so, are there concrete takeaways that could be incorporated into PWIs or other HBCUs, even though those institutions weren't created explicitly to censor Black women?
So yes, I mean, I don't think it's surprising, to have participants who attended Spelman, right, and talk about, this amazing experience that they had. But for those who were, attending predominantly white institutions, it was these pretty much those offices within that fall under multicultural affairs or diversity, equity, and inclusion. The other entity that I think was really central for women was participating in a sorority. So we start off every interview asking, what's one of your most memorable college experiences? And, asking, bring an artifact, share an artifact. And more often than not, they brought in, something that dealt with their sorority, or they talked about the sorority experience. And so although, the sorority experience was really positive, I don't think you have to be in a sorority to be connected to, other Black women on campus. And so it's the sorority experience, but I think there's something special. And I think that's what's kind of embedded in that question, that when you think about, I guess, the nuanced experience of Black women, you can't deny the connection between Black women, right? Like whatever we build, whatever that thing is called, there needs to be some sort of infrastructure or support to make sure that happens, whether you're in a sorority or not, right? It can happen through Res Life, it can happen through student activities, but allowing Black women the space. And I think, Denise, you may have mentioned it earlier. Somebody talked about just Black women needing a space to just come together, right? We need that space. And so that is really important. And it goes back to also what you said, Kayla, that these don't have to be these overwhelmingly deep policy things. Like common sense is Black women need other Black women. So let's create the space for Black women to come together. It's as simple as that. And so, yes, some of the participants talked about having a wonderful experience at, Spelman, but they also talked about having wonderful experiences at their predominantly white institutions, but those experiences were often couched in the Black sorority experience or, Black undergraduate groups specifically designed, through the Culture Center, where they found a space to be safe, where they could be themselves. And not have to deal with some of the challenges that are part of being at a predominantly white institution.
I want to be mindful of time. I know we have a couple more questions, but I do want to just one last question. Oh, it might be a reflective one for all of us, but what does the future look like for Black women scholars? Is it worth staying in academia given the institutional violence that we experience on a daily basis in these academic spaces? I am not in academia, so I am going to leave that to those that choose to answer.
Me neither. So my answer will be brief. Change is necessary from everywhere, from every facet, every part, public, private, nonprofit, governmental. Change is necessary from everywhere, right? And as you see, we show up in partnership, regardless of where we sit or because of where we sit, right? And so I think like the choice to be in academia, outside, in industry, wherever it is, I think what the choice should be based on is how you want to apply the skills and knowledge that you have learned, right? One of the things I said is I want my research to have feet and I wanted to have some speed too, right? And I think that's a fundamental difference between academia and think tanks or advocacy orgs in the DC space is literally walking my feet to the hill, but also a much shorter publication process, right? And much shorter pieces, as Dr. Patton Davis alluded to, right? So it depends on the impact that you want to make, how you want to apply your research and skills. And many of us loop in and out of the academy. And as you have seen, most of us wear multiple hats as well. So I would say, do what's right to make the change you want to achieve.
Yes. One last question. Would you reflect on how communities can help Black girls starting at preschool level get on track to higher education and economic security? Final question of the night.
I think communities are doing it. I wish I had this question ahead of time because I would have thought of some. But I mean, I think there's like Black Girls Code, like there are Brown Girls Mentoring. I think there are a lot of community-led organizations led by Black women who are trying to expose girls really early to, STEM and art and like all of these pieces. So the women in the Mary Jane Legacy Project, those who were in STEM, of course, they struggle. They were the only ones, there. And so I think these community organizations are doing wonderful work in terms of bringing in cohorts of girls and through mentoring, teaching them how to support one another, or through coding and STEM, teaching them, all of these different skills so that there's a greater likelihood, this exposure to STEM early, I think helps to remove the veil of fear that I think some Black girls often experience in terms of pursuing those particular fields, especially when they go to college. So I think, at least from my perspective, I think that is the value of community-based organizations, realizing what Black girls need well in advance before they even are trying to apply, to college, and partnering with, local school districts and providing these opportunities that they might not otherwise have.
Yes, as my 20 years of research has shown, believe it or not, you all, Black girls, the person who asked the question, Black girls and young women, they are doing what they're supposed to be doing. But there are policies and systems in schools as early as early childhood education, kindergarten. You know, we're seeing 3-year-olds being suspended and 6-year-olds being handcuffed. The problem is that they are being still policed and pushed out and punished and resisted from pre-K all the way through 22. Okay, so a part of our job as researchers and policy advocates is to actually document Black girls, Black women's, and families and communities' efforts. That's what we're trying to do from a resiliency perspective.
And if I can, I want to offer a response that actually goes back to the one before, the question about whether to stay in the academy or not. So when I work with Black women doc students, they're like, Dr. Ward, what's the point of staying in the academy? And I asked them the question, where on the planet can a Black woman go where she will be respected and her knowledge will be valued? And so I would say, and I'm not, advocating to stay in the academy if it's, a place that you can't bear. But what I am saying is that if you do choose to stay in, do the things that are important to you. And this connects with the question about the community. A lot of Black women scholars that I know, they are in partnership with communities and using their research to help with these kinds of programs that are supportive of young people that are in the K-12 system. And so I would just invite Black women, make a determination, where is a space that you can bear? Because again, no space, including higher ed, was made for us, cares for us. The law is a tool, but we already know that it hasn't brought us the legal redress and the justice that we deserve. And so what do? We stay in the academy or we go to think tanks, but ultimately we make decisions to be in places where what we believe and want to do, we can make a contribution. And yeah, I think hopefully that's helpful in terms of thinking about what you can do in the academy as well as in the community. It can position you to do those things and use your research as a tool that can really be helpful to folks.
Well, ladies, this has been a phenomenal conversation and one much needed in the policy space. So thank you all. Each of the panelists have you've offered so many perspectives and pushed us to really make Black women's educational achievement and equity, economic equity really matter. I also want to especially thank the Mary Jane Legacy Project leads, Dr. Nadrea Njoku and Dr. Ayana Hardaway. They've done a phenomenal job with doing this work. I also want to especially acknowledge the Lumina Foundation as the funder for this project. Thank you to the Ohio State University College of Education and Human Ecology for housing the Mary Jane Legacy Project through its initial phase and providing a platform for tonight's webinar. Kudos to Stephanie and Julie behind the scenes. We appreciate you. Y'all have a good night.
Thank you.